All right, welcome back, everybody. Live at Drew's house, another edition. Hope everybody is doing okay out there as we move into March and start making our way towards spring. Very exciting. I'm going to bring on a guest that we've had on the show before, a return guest, first time Zoom style. Mike Morris, he's the lead author of the Newburyport Climate Resiliency Plan. He's also been a part of the Storm Surge. You remember that group doing all that great stuff for the shores of Plum Island and really just very interesting work. I remember really enjoying our last conversation. Mike Morris, how are you, sir?
Great. How are you today?
Doing good. Everybody healthy in the pandemic?
Yes, we've been dodging the COVID arrows in our family, and everybody's good.
It is. It's good to hear that. So many families have it being struck by it in some way, shape, or form. But that is good. And I hope let me start with this, because we have a lot of directions I can go with. But I know we just had a big election. There's a new president. The last president wasn't really all that climate friendly. A man like you must have been very happy to see that transition.
Yeah. There's hope, I guess, whereas before there was no hope. And, we are 4 more years behind the 8 ball, so there is a lot of work to do. But it's also encouraging to see the private sector actually taking more of the lead than our federal government has. For example, the car companies are really gearing up to produce electric vehicles very soon in the future, and that technology has evolved very quickly and will continue to. So that's an encouraging development.
Let me get a little bit into this. I read this in the Newburyport Daily News, and it seems to be a big story in our neck of the woods. It sounded very familiar to something we talked about a couple of years ago, and I know is an ongoing problem on Plum Island, and they're probably connected, and it's probably one big problem that's going to be facing the whole coastline. But the rapid erosion of Salisbury Beach is in the news. I'm sure you've been watching it. What should we know about that?
Well, with sea level rise, more frequent and more intense storms, we're going to see barrier beaches erode. And that's not just Salisbury and Plum Island, but it's really a malady that every barrier beach is experiencing worldwide. And in a rising sea scenario, the ocean basically attacks the shore, starts moving sand around until it gets to the point where it can find its way over or through the dunes. And ultimately what happens is the barrier island gets pushed back over the marsh and tries to reestablish itself there. The conflict, of course, is that we have house lots in certain locations that don't want to move with what nature wants to move. And so therein lies the conflict, trying to hold the line.
And there's no debating what is happening, right? This is not like one of those things. It's very clear to you and everybody else who watches this stuff and studies it. This is what's happening, and these houses are going to go.
Yeah, unfortunately, at some point, it probably won't happen all at once unless we get the right storm. But nature's persistent. It works on the shore every day. And, if I could draw people's attention to Newburyport's Climate Resiliency Plan, there's a good section with a lot of pictures on Plum Island, and some of it pertains to Salisbury Beach, and there's actually photos of some things on Salisbury Beach sort of demonstrating what's been going on. But Salisbury specifically, I think in the area where the erosion is occurring, what we have showing up on the beach side and also just in the nearshore shallows is actually ancient marsh that used to be behind Salisbury Beach. And there are actually hoof prints from horses in it and things like that. So you ask, well, how does a marsh that used to be behind the beach end up in front of the beach? Well, that's because the beach stepped back over the marsh, and now the ocean's moving that sand around, and we're starting to see that peat and that clay and all that stuff from the marsh starting to emerge. So it's already started happening long before we actually recognized this, and long before Salisbury Beach was developed. Just now, I think it's starting to accelerate, right? Because sea level rise is accelerating and storms are stronger. And so we're seeing the process really unfold. Whereas typically it might be more of a slow geologic process that, most people wouldn't notice.
And that is climate change. That is the sea level, and that's what it is.
Right.
So we changed that term from global warming so people don't get confused about it's warm in the wintertime, and that's a bad thing. That's what climate change is.
Yeah, I mean, climate change is really about weather extremes, right? Because, it's always cold on the poles. It's dark and cold in the winter, right? At the North Pole, can't help but be way below zero. The equator is always warmer, and the Earth always struggles to balance those two temperature extremes. And so you have cold air masses that pour south and warm air masses that move north, and storms that sort of mix the two. But in a warming climate, those undulations in the jet stream that separate those two types of air masses become very extreme. So you can have crazy cold all the way down in Texas, like we had over the last couple of weeks, and you'll start to see some warm air moving further north along the East Coast after we get past this cold snap we're in today.
When you build these houses in these places, Plum Island, along Salisbury Beach, and you look at it now and you say that probably wasn't the wisest idea in the world. Has it just been that, builders and looked at this and said, it's beautiful, we should build a house here? Was it a lack of knowledge about what could happen? Or was it just that it probably won't happen in our lifetimes, but you know what, here it is, this escalation. What do you attribute that to?
Oh, I think there's a few things going on there. Certainly, if you're a builder or a developer and you're building a house to sell, or you bought a house to renovate and sell, I mean, your window is short, right? You've got a short-term goal of turning this thing around in a couple of years, and so long-term, what's happening is really not an issue. It's about making money. For people who have had houses that are in a family, for example, have been in a family for a few generations, it's more of an emotional connection. People have grown up there. There's a lot of family memories, and to see that property threatened, something people don't want to part with. I certainly understand what, Plum Island's magical, right? When the weather's great, it's summertime, and you get up early and go down the beach at sunrise and sunsets, and surf and swim whenever you want. It's a great place, and I certainly understand the allure. But you also have to be realistic about where you are. And I think a lot of people really don't understand the risk exposure that they have by sinking all of their eggs into a house on a barrier beach. It's risky, and again, if I direct people to Newburyport's Climate Resiliency Plan, look up the section on Plum Island, you can see really what the risk exposure is. And it's really something you need to consider in terms, especially if you're thinking of buying a home along, Plum Island or any other barrier beach. But it also just gives you an idea of, where you are in geologic time, and, the challenges that are being faced down there.
And stopping this erosion is that I see some of the lines in this article I was reading, before I brought you on, and we have state senators involved now, congresswomen and congressmen talking about this issue, and something needs to be done. This is dire. I'm sure you would say this has been dire for a long, long time. Is that correct?
Well, beach erosion is a story that never goes away. It might move from one part of the beach to another part of the beach, and that's just part of the whole process. It doesn't always happen all at once uniformly along every shore. It usually eats here, eats there. Some parts recover, some parts are under greater risk. And certainly, if your house has waves washing down around it, your situation is critical. It's a big ocean. Weather systems are huge, and the climate isn't waiting for anybody. It's a tough position to be in. I wouldn't want to be a homeowner in that position.
Is there anything to be done to slow it, to stop it? I know you guys had all sorts of projects, and I'm sure part of it is in this resiliency plan, but what can practically be done by just the average Joe?
Well, ultimately you're delaying the inevitable, right? So, if you got a house sitting on a foundation and a receding shoreline, your house is vulnerable, right? I mean, obviously you can buy some time by elevating the house and letting the water run underneath, but ultimately that shoreline is looking to step back. Plum Island Point in particular, a lot of it has to do with the jetty system. It's of such a design that it's holding a lot of sand back on the ocean-facing beach, which was eroding prior to its repair, but it's starving Reservation Terrace of sand. And it's my opinion that if they put a little notch in the jetty and let some sand pass through, they could strike a balance between the two shores and at least keep people happy moving forward into the future. Right now, I think that's a man-made situation. Over in Salisbury, I haven't looked at that in too much detail, but Salisbury has a barrier beach, has much less sand than Plum Island. It's much narrower and it's not as high. So it's going to be susceptible to any, increases in wave activity and things like that. So I would see erosion, being, something that Salisbury is very susceptible to.
And we've, of course, seen in Newburyport, I think they call it that, the Reservation Terrace area there. That,
right.
The flooding is just commonplace now.
Well, history's repeated itself, right? So the last time this happened, and of course, not a ton of attention was paid back in the 70s because Plum Island wasn't really a desirable place to live back then. But we had a newly repaired jetty system. Erosion started happening as soon as they fixed the jetty, because the jetty, just like it does today, holds sand back on the main beach. And the Reservation Terrace eroded. They lost the Coast Guard station. And we had, they tried a bunch of things. They pumped a bunch of sand in. That went away fairly quickly. They put sandbags out. Eventually things got to be very desperate, and somebody dumped a bunch of junk cars on the beach because that's all they could afford to do. If you look closely, you can still find parts to those cars out there. But ultimately what happened to correct the situation back in the 70s is we had the storm of 78. Storm came in. It was a long duration storm, big wave energy, lots of flooding, and it disheveled a bunch of rocks in the jetty. And it allowed some sand to start finding its way through. And ultimately the shore stabilized. Once it stabilized, everybody's said, well, okay, it just changed and everybody forgot about it. And, let's move on to something else. And we can see that trying to happen these days. The little pulses of sand do make it through, but obviously not enough to stabilize that shore.
That is fascinating. I didn't quite realize all that. So that's fascinating stuff. And Salisbury's looking at that as a what could happen situation there, the flooding on the terrace. And of course, that's why you're hearing terms like dire situation in Salisbury. So it's not a good, there's not much positive there, Mike Morris, as I listen to you, unless, you almost caught a break with the storm of 78 to stabilize things for a little while. It seems odd to be almost hoping for those things, but basically there's not much good news when it comes to beach erosion in our neck of the woods.
Yeah, I mean, you can engage in projects of beach nourishment, but it's all temporary, right? Because, I mean, the ocean is moving sand along, it's moving it to other places, and those processes aren't going to stop. So it's sort of like having a bucket with a hole in it. And beach nourishment is basically adding more water to the bucket. It's always running away and running out of the bucket. As long as you keep the beach nourished periodically, you create an artificial buffer. But how long can you sustain that for?
Again, I'm joined here by Mike Morris, lead author of the Newburyport Climate Resiliency Plan, and of course, just a information booth when it comes to beach erosion in our neck of the woods here and along the coastline. A bigger picture, we don't treat our oceans very well, do we?
Yeah, I mean, no, we don't at all. There's a lot of plastics, a lot of garbage. I mean, as a surfer, I see it all the time, and it goes down the toilet to the wastewater treatment plant. If there's a, combined sewer overflow, those solids get flushed out and straight into the Merrimack River, and off they go out to sea, and eventually all that stuff washes back up on Plum Island and Salisbury Beach and other beaches.
It is great. And I mean, when you talk about, we talked a little bit about climate change to start this conversation, and I know we're learning so much. So there's so many great documentaries out there right now about, whether it be the cattle industry and all that runoff that goes into the ocean. I think people think sometimes it's just the plastics and the trash that end up there, and it's really a whole lot more than that that's polluting our oceans.
Yeah, I mean, the oceans are big and they're very resilient. They can take a lot. I mean, they've been absorbing much of the heat that climate change has been retaining from our atmosphere. They've been really the big balancer of our climate, sort of tempering the temperature rise by absorbing much of the heat. But those changes, ocean acidification is happening because of all the CO2 that's being absorbed by the ocean as well. Plus we got, your run-of-the-mill pollution from agriculture, fertilizers, and that sort of runoff. And the oceans are having a hard time absorbing all of this. I mean, on a very simple level, we're basically a colony of bacteria in a petri dish called the Earth, right? And we can live here happily until we consume all of our resources and contaminate our confined environment to the point until it becomes uninhabitable. So we're starting to see the effects as a biological population where we're bumping up against limiting growth factors, right? We are, experiencing the consequences of pollution, and certainly you can see that diseases like COVID and things like that are also limiting factors, starting to affect us. So, nature is sort of sounding the alarm bell and say, hey, you need to wake up here a little bit and modify your behavior and, do something that'll help you sustain your ability to survive on this planet.
What is your take on the whole COVID? Obviously, we're living in this pandemic here that, hopefully once in a lifetime, although I've heard people look at me and say, I would expect another one in your lifetime. I've had educated people say that to me. I wonder, what is your take on COVID? Because I've heard people say that line exactly that you just did about how it's interesting how nature pushes back sometimes. I think we're going to learn a whole lot more about COVID and how it started and exact detail for detail in years to come. But just a broad brush, what's your thought on nature pushing back? That line that you just said, give me a little more on that.
Well, sure. So, going back to the simple example of a bacteria or any other biological population, they can't control their future, right? I mean, they can't engineer their way out of a problem. Squirrels run out of acorns, they can't grow anymore, right? They don't know how to do that, so they starve and die off. We being humans, we are able to identify problems and figure out a way out of it, right? So we're doing that with COVID. But nature does throw that. I mean, that's just the way nature works. Populations, they rise and fall in waveforms where, they grow when there are resources and the conditions are right. Human population's been on an exponential growth curve since the start of the industrial age because we're, able to make lives better. We're able to feed people better and more efficiently. We've been able to engineer our way around, diseases and things like that. Now we've got climate change facing us. That's a big problem. We know what it is. We have actual solutions. The question is, when are we going to start to do something about it? But, the Earth has a ton of viruses locked away in Pandora's box somewhere. And when we open those boxes and let them out, sometimes, they affect us. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that's going to happen again at some point. When is hard to say. It was certainly a fairly threatening situation at the time, right? I mean, here you have a disease that's transmitted through intimate contact. I mean, that could have really been a problem had we not taken public health measures to change people's behavior, because there really was no cure for AIDS. I mean, there's treatment for it and they can prolong life, but that's just another example.
Yeah, AIDS, absolutely. I wonder, when you see the United States under the Trump administration, the last 4 years, we talked about this at the beginning, remove the country from so many of those climate initiatives that I think, you can probably sit back and say, I wish more was being done. I wish more was being done, but there was nothing good about leaving so many of those initiatives. Just that must have people like you. It must have just torn your heart out to see that.
Yeah, I mean, the United States is looked at as by the rest of the world as the leader. They always look to us about what's the right thing to do. They looked to us for, our political system and our democracy, and they were looking for us to lead on climate. And what's crazy about the whole thing is that when it comes to who's the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases, from the start of the industrial age, it's been the United States. I mean, if you want to say who's to blame for climate change, well, we're the ones, right? Because we had the big industrial economy and we consumed a lot of fossil fuels. And certainly other countries are coming along the way because they want our lifestyle, right? I mean, so China's coming online, India's coming online, and they're all contributors as well. But, we need to lead on this, and we need somebody needs to do that, and we weren't doing it for the last 4 years because somehow, well, it's just frustrating, I mean, for me, being trained as a scientist not to ignore facts, to ignore facts and make policy decisions based on belief instead of reality was just nonsense. It was just craziness,
What would you say to the people that are? I mean, I know Plum Island is really your specialty. You've done a lot of real digging and time there. But even I know Salisbury Beach is being in the news. What would you say to people along the coast? What is the practical thing? Because everybody wants to know. Okay, dire problem. What do we do? What is it?
It's a dire problem. What do we do about our vulnerability along the beach? Well, I'll tell you what I did. The way I looked at it, and there were discussions with my wife. We had a house on Plum Island. It was safe. It was far enough away from the ocean, and it was far enough away to be flooded from the marsh, and it was 11 feet in the air. But everybody's tolerance for risk is different. In mine, I know too much. I know too much about weather. I know too much about storms, and I see major storms miss us by a few hundred miles. That's sort of like standing in your backyard and having somebody shoot at a deer and have the bullet go whistling by your head and think nothing of it, But that's not the case for most people. They don't understand, how close we've come to having some huge natural disasters here. So for me, there was too much risk down there. Number one, I didn't want to be the guy trying to sell a house that had water flooding underneath it, knowingly selling it to somebody that wouldn't be able to live there for another 30 years. Certainly there was a window when property values rebounded to an extent after, the previous disasters we had down there. I had a son going to college, and we had somebody who wanted to buy the house. And I'm like, you know what? This is the right time for us to sell. And so for me, my level of risk tolerance was low. Other people might, say, well, I've had people come to me and say, you know what? I want to buy this house. It's located right here. Do you think I might get 10 years out of it? Because if I can get 10 summers out of it, it's worth it to me to spend $500,000 and buy this house. Because people are looking at it sort of as a, it's a vacation. Summer vacation, and 10 years of summer vacations for $500,000 to them was worth it. But you have somebody else. This is a family home, and they've inherited it from their parents and whatever. Memories are there, and maybe that's their financial nest egg. Their position is going to be a whole lot different because they don't want to give that up, and hence they may tolerate more risk because they don't want to give up that property.
It's heartbreaking to see those decisions have to be made, really, too, especially in that latter scenario that you just said, when you're talking about families and homes and memories of decades. Absolutely crazy. I will end on let's end on a little bit of a lighter note. I remember talking, you had some fantastic surf stories. How's the surfing going? You still do it this time of year or what?
Well, I haven't been surfing too much. Last year I had a crazy vacation in Australia. My son was going to school over there for a semester, and we flew out to visit him. And it's one of these vacations that was both magical and disastrous at the same time. So, as we're getting on the plane, we find out that he was bitten by some poisonous spider and was in the hospital. And, so when we arrived there, we didn't know if we were going to have a vacation or would be sitting by him bedside. Fortunately, he was able to be treated and discharged. And we spent some magical days out on a island on the Great Barrier Reef, and did a lot of really cool snorkeling with sea turtles and even some sharks, which was fairly exciting to be in the water with them without a cage around you. But while I was surfing with my son back on the mainland, a number of days later, I actually had a heart attack out on the surf, and had to find my way back to the beach and schlep myself up to where my wife was. And it all turned out okay. Lifeguards got me to the hospital. But it was kind of a wacky thing. So I've sort of pulled back from a lot of my volunteer activities, trying to bring the stress level down because I was just burning the candles at too many ends. And I started getting back into shape to get back in the water. And I typically did that by swimming down at the Y. And but since COVID came on, I can't do that right now. So kind of waiting for this pandemic to end, get my vaccine, and get back on the board.
Man, well, I did not know that, Mike. I'm glad to see you're up and at 'em and doing okay here. Good thing you're still with us. My goodness, I did not know that story.
Yeah, it's a wacky one. Not something I necessarily want to experience.
Yeah, I can imagine you wouldn't want to experience that again. Last one here, as and I'll give you a little heads up. The mailman is showing up at the house, which is usually dogs go crazy times. So we're gonna roll the dice here.
Okay.
And continue on for the final question here. Timing is everything, but I did want to ask you, what's the one story all those years of just being along the shoreline, doing all the science work, digging through the sand, looking through rocks. Is there one story that, I don't know, maybe it was magical to you for something that you found, or maybe it was just something that caught you off guard, just nature amazed you? Is there one story, maybe there's 100 of them, but is there one story that really gets you?
Well, I guess the one story that, that comes to mind, and I don't know if I've told this story before, but was an early morning at Plum Island. We were still living down there. It was before work, just after sunrise, and I walked to the top of the beach with my dog to the beach entrance just to look at the ocean, and saw there were a bunch of fish out there, school of bait fish and probably stripers feeding on them, and birds diving in. I said, oh, well, that looks pretty exciting. So I ran back up my paddleboard and paddled out to check it out. And by the time I got back up there, the feeding frenzy, if you will, sort of abated, and clouds kind of moved in. It was a little bit overcast, and the wind came up a little bit. It wasn't nice and glassy anymore. They said, well, I'm here, might as well just do a quick workout, right? So I'm like, all right, I'm just going to paddle down towards Mad Martha's and turn around and come back. And so I'm paddling along. It was high tide, going along the inside of the offshore bar system, so in a deep channel. And I'm kind of just coasting along with the wind, and I spot a couple of lobster pot buoys I'm going to tack and turn around. So I just pull the paddle up, and I'm standing on the board just sailing along with the wind. And all of a sudden, I get slammed from underneath right at the tail of the board. I go falling forward. I didn't fall off the board, but I went down onto all fours, and I turn around and look back, and I see this huge boil of water come up from underneath the board. And I was obviously hit by a shark, right? There aren't any rocks. I mean, the boil of water, that's just reminded me of when I used to tuna fish with my dad. You sort of recognize boils in the water associated with certain sizes of fish. And this boil was so huge, I knew it was something big. So that certainly rattled me. I didn't know what to do. Do I stand up and, keep paddling? Do I grab one of these buoys and wait for a boat? There was nobody around, it was 6:30 in the morning. I paddled back towards shore and then back along the beach and made it back in. But I had a couple of well, 5 actual tooth scrape marks across the bottom of the board where the shark hit the board. And there was an indentation from the shark's snout where he actually struck. So that was probably my most exciting encounter that I've had down there.
You still have the board? You got a little memory there, huh?
I do. I still have the board. In retrospect, the shark, recognized the shape from underneath. He was cruising along the bottom, looked up, says, "Oh, that looks like something I might want to check out," and came up and gave me a pretty good nudge. But then, as he got closer, he realized I wasn't a seal, and then tried to veer off, but still, basically ran into the board in the process.
Yeah, I mean, and there have been quite a few shark attacks here, especially on the Cape. That's become a much more regular thing. I mean, I know percentage-wise, it's not too crazy, but it's
yeah, they're around. I think they've always been around. The type of shark that swims along the bottom, so you very rarely see them. I oftentimes go by my sixth sense when I'm in the water. If I start feeling uneasy about something, I think it's this primitive sense that a lot of people have learned to ignore these days, but I think it's real. There have been times when I've been in the water where it just didn't feel right, and I got out. Maybe I was dreaming it up, but sometimes you got to listen to those things.
No, I understand that. Mike Morris, it's always a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it again, as always. I'm glad to see you're doing well. I'm sorry to hear about the heart attack story, but I'm glad to hear you're back on your feet and things are going well.
Yeah, we're doing okay.
Go get that COVID shot. Hopefully you got to get that thing when you get your shot at the shot, right?
Exactly.
I wish you and your family all the best health, and thank you so much for the time, as always, man. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Drew.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
All right. Mike Morris, lead author of the Newburyport Climate Resiliency Plan. As you can see there, he's one of those science guys that knows a whole lot about our area, has really been on there, on the ground, on the beaches, in the water, studying this stuff for a long time. Great work with storm surge, too. There's the dogs. I knew it was coming. See, time to wrap up. They know it. Great work with storm surge, though, that program for so many years. He's just told me, now I know why he took a step back, because of the heart attack. But glad to see he's doing well. And Mike Morris, always a pleasure. All right, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Stay healthy. Get the vaccine when you get your shot at the shot. All right. Live at Drew's house. Bye-bye now.